The tin cracked like a rifle shot. Elias Carr stared at the split canister in his hands, stunned. The coffee beans inside had frozen so hard the iron gave way before the contents did. The last of his stash, collected with care through trades and trail swaps, was now a rock-solid lump that wouldn't budge under a hammer. Outside, the storm moaned like a church organ, its wind carving white dunes across the log cabin's roof. Inside, breath curled in front of every man's face like ghosts looking for a way out. Elias sat back down by the cold stove, rubbing his gloved hands together. The firewood had run out 3 days ago. Wet branches and old fence rails weren't enough to keep a flame. The stove glowed orange for a while, then went dark again, like a dying heartbeat. Water froze in cups overnight. Socks froze in boots. And now, the beans, his last hope for warmth that felt like home, were frozen too. But Elias had a trick, not a loud one. Not something you'd find in a book. It was something he'd learned 12 winters ago from a Mescalero Apache scout named Coho, who believed that fire was too proud. Fire burns fast, he'd said. Stone remembers slow. So that night, when the others curled in their blankets, cursing the cold and praying for sleep, Elias got to work. He cleared a spot on the table, right where the draft from the door didn't reach. Then he reached into his bedroll and pulled out what looked like a pouch of river rocks. Smooth, dark, heavy. Most cowboys would have tossed them out as dead weight. Elias had carried them for years. He laid them out in a circle. Not random, he set them with intention, each one touching the next like they were holding hands. In the middle, he placed the cracked tin, still sealed but filled with frozen beans that had defeated metal, and then he waited. Because the stones weren't warm yet, not on their own, but buried beneath the stove's ash bin, he'd kept 2 of them wrapped in wool, near the last coals, just enough to catch and hold what the fire had once given. He slid those into the ring first, then the others, then the lid. No flame, no smoke, no light. Just quiet, ancient heat. He sat there, watching the steam rise in faint curls from the edges of the ring. The men snored behind him, unaware. The wind screamed against the logs. But for the first time in days, Elias didn't feel cold. He wasn't trying to make coffee yet. He was teaching the beans how to breathe again. The next morning, the cabin reeked of wet wool and frustration. Clay Dobbs was trying to light a fire with frozen pine bark, muttering curses under his breath like they'd spark something. Jesse brought in snow in a battered tin pail and stared at it like he expected it to boil on its own. No one spoke to Elias until they saw the ring. "What in hell are you doing with them pebbles?" Clay barked. "Praying to the bean gods?" Jesse chuckled, kicking snow off his boots. "Ain't. No warmth coming from a pile of rocks. Carr, you lose your mind with the coffee?" Elias didn't look up. He just tapped the lid of the cracked tin with his knuckle. The metal had softened overnight. Still cold, but no longer brittle. He could hear the faintest tick when he shook at the sound of beans knocking loose, like the clatter of dice in a gambler's palm. The men weren't convinced. They snorted, they mocked. One even dropped a stone down the back of Elias's coat, expecting a reaction. But Elias had lived through too many winters to waste breath on pride. He just took the stone out, placed it gently back in the circle, and whispered something under his breath. Coho once told him, "Fire wants to be seen, stone wants to serve." The day passed slow. The storm outside showed no signs of breaking, no sun, no wind change, just the same pale, blinding gray that made time meaningless. They ate hardtack with cracked molars and passed around a bottle of something that wasn't quite whiskey. By evening, no one was laughing. The men were quieter now, hungrier for warmth and humor. Clay sat on his bunk, shivering so hard his hat rattled against the wall. Jesse tried to warm his boots by holding them under his arms. The tin stove sat in the corner like a tombstone, useless and cold. Then Elias opened the lid. A hiss, soft as a breath, slipped out. Steam, real steam, fogged the air. The beans inside had loosened. Not cooked, not scorched, just pliable, awake. Elias held the tin close, passed his gloved fingers through the vapor, and smiled like he'd heard an old friend speak for the first time in years. Clay sniffed the air. "Is that?" Elias didn't answer. He took the beans out, wrapped them in a cotton cloth, and began to crush them slowly with the heel of his knife. The scent that rose was unmistakable. Roast, dark, rich, coffee. The men leaned in like wolves smelling blood, but Elias didn't rush. This wasn't for them, not yet. This was for the ritual, for the rhythm that kept a man sane when everything else turned white and still. Let them laugh. By dawn, they'd be asking for a cup. By midnight, the fire still hadn't caught. Jesse gave up trying and fell asleep with his arms wrapped around his knees, boots still frozen solid. Clay was curled near the wall like a dog, too proud to admit it was cold. The wind moaned through the cracks in the logs, but Elias didn't flinch. He was busy setting the stones again. He knew how long it took for heat to move without flame. Most men thought warmth only came from fire flames, licking high, crackling, demanding attention. But Elias had long since learned the secret of quiet heat, the kind that seeps, that holds. That doesn't shout. The center of the ring now held a pot, tin, dented, blackened from use. Inside was nothing fancy, just snowmelt and the grounds he'd crushed an hour before. The beans had softened around the edges, still stubborn in the center, but he could tell they were close. He placed 2 of the warmer stones directly beneath the pot, careful not to scorch the bottom. Then he covered it all with his old wool scarf, trapping the heat like a prayer under a blanket. And then he waited, not with impatience, with reverence. The cabin was silent, save for the occasional creak of timber shifting under snow weight. His breath came slow. He closed his eyes and thought of his father, who used to say, "Coffee ain't just a drink, son, it's the smell of the sun showing up." Elias never forgot that. And out here, where the sun hadn't broken through in days, this was the only light he had left to make. An hour passed, maybe 2. Then came the smell. It didn't roar in like a campfire. It bloomed soft, bitter-sweet, earthy. Not strong enough to wake a man from sleep, but enough to make him dream of better mornings. Elias removed the scarf. The pot was sweating. Not boiling, sweating. That meant the beans were releasing their oils, the water had turned, the brew was real. He poured a small amount into his cup. Dark, murky, beautiful. He didn't drink it. Not yet. He just held it in both hands, warming his palms, letting the scent wrap around him like a wool coat from the inside. It wasn't about caffeine. It wasn't about habit. It was about reminder. That even in a world gone white with silence, something could still stir, could still rise, could still make a man feel human again. Elias took his first sip as the stove cracked suddenly in the corner. One log half burned. Forgotten had finally caught. Flame flickered through the iron door. Not because someone willed it, because the room had remembered what warmth was. And now, so had they. Elias didn't mean to wake anyone. But the smell had other plans. It crept through the bunkhouse like a hymn, low and warm, soaked in memory. Before the cold, before the hunger, before the storm, there had been mornings, real ones, with fire, crackle, biscuit, crumb, and the bitter blessing of cowboy coffee. And now, somehow, that smell was back, sneaking through frost-stiffened noses and into the sleeping minds of men who'd given up on comfort. Jesse was the first to stir. He didn't speak, just sniffed, slow and confused, as if his dream had wandered into something holy. Clay rolled over, grumbled, and then froze literally and figuratively. His eyes cracked open. He stared across the cabin at Elias, who was hunched over the pot with a cup in his hands, face steam-shadowed and silent. "You makin'?" Clay's voice croaked. "You brewin' that?" Elias didn't look up. He just nodded once and sipped slow. No one asked where the fire came from. It was clear by the pale flicker in the stove that it hadn't come from kindling. It was the stones, the warmth, the ritual. The flame in Elias's hands had started inside, not under. Jesse sat up and swung his legs over the bunk, boots still hard as bone. "You serious?" he muttered. "That ain't just." "Heated water?" Elias took another sip. Then he poured a second cup and slid it across the table with a nod. Jesse took it. He didn't even blow on it. He just held it in his calloused hands like it was church. Then he drank. No sound, no gasp. Just a long, quiet exhale, and then, hotter than I deserve. That's when Clay stood. Didn't even put on his coat. Just walked barefoot across the frozen floor and stood beside the table, eyes wide, hat in hand. He didn't ask for a cup, he just waited. Elias poured a third. As the sun cracked the horizon barely visible, just a smear of dull orange against a gray sky, the cabin changed. The cold didn't leave, but it loosened its grip. The men sat closer, didn't talk much. Just drank. Outside, the snow crunched. A rider passed on the trail, bundled heavy, face hidden. He caught the scent too, turned his head, slowed his horse. But he didn't stop. He just nodded once toward the chimney. Some things didn't need explaining. By the time the pot was empty, Elias had already started placing stones back around it for another brew. No one mocked him now, no one asked how, they just watched. Because something had shifted, not just in the cabin, in them. And it started with the smell that shouldn't have existed, but did. By the second pot, no one was sleeping anymore. They weren't lively, just awake. The kind of awake a man gets after he's remembered something he didn't know he'd lost. Jesse stared into his tin cup like it was showing him visions. Clay rubbed his knuckles along the steam rising from the second brew and said nothing, but the shake in his shoulders had eased. No one asked for more, but when Elias poured it, they drank. It wasn't just warmth they needed, it was ritual. Out here, ritual mattered more than most realized. It wasn't religion, wasn't superstition. It was the rope that kept a man tethered when everything else blew away in the wind. A cup in the morning, a story at night. The act of doing something on purpose. Elias had built a ritual from a cracked tin, a circle of rocks, and a few tricks learned in worse winters. But what he gave them was more than coffee. It was choice in a season that offered none. The storm broke on the third day. Just like that, the wind fell still. The sun, dull and distant, peeked through the clouds. And the bunkhouse breathed out in one long collective exhale. Men stood and stretched. Someone chopped a log. Clay found dry kindling beneath the floorboards and built a fire that caught without argument. But even with real flames licking in the stove, Elias still made his circle. He placed his stones slow and careful, set the pot, poured the meltwater, let it steep while the others watched. No one mocked it, no one interrupted, because now they understood. It wasn't about caffeine. It wasn't even about survival, it was about remembering why you survive. That cup at dawn meant something again. It wasn't a luxury, it was identity. It was a small, defiant stand against the kind of cold that tried to erase who you were. Years later, Jesse would carry 3 stones in his saddlebag. Clay taught his sons how to trap warmth without fire, said it was better than flint on days the wind howled too hard. Even strangers heard of it. Called it Cowboy brewing, or fireless boil, or just Elias's way. No one filed a patent, no one made money. But every man who survived a brutal winter remembered the taste. It wasn't just coffee. It was the ritual that saved the cold.